Good afternoon. Welcome today to our webinar. We're lucky enough to have Dr. Kevin Cain from Axiota Animal Health presenting about Multimin 90 and how it can be used in high selenium areas and bypass antagonists. Sorry about that. And so just to give a little background for those of you who, maybe are confused why Ward Laboratories is putting on this webinar about this specific mineral supplement. So here's how it kind of came about. I, consulting with producers, have always gotten questions about this specific supplement in high selenium areas. And over the years, I've asked several different Multimin reps and not really gotten a great answer. But at the Sandhills Ranch Expo this year, me and Mick met Al Schoenfeld, who I'll introduce in just a minute. And he had some really good insights about using Multimin in those areas, being as his territory is North and South Dakota. He's very well versed on this topic and brought in Dr. Cain to really give us the science behind it. So we're very excited to get some of these questions answered. So just some housekeeping things. As Dr. Cain is giving his presentation, feel free to type your questions in the chat or type them in the Q&A, and we will be having a Q&A with myself, Al, as well as Dr. Cain after the presentation. So any questions you might have, go ahead and type them in so that you don't lose them. And I think that's really all the housekeeping we have. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Al. So Al Schoenfeld has been a technical marketing rep for Multimin, which is an Axiota animal health company, for 5 years. And he also lives in East Central South Dakota, where he owns and operates an 80-cow herd. He has his bachelor's degree in animal science from the University of Minnesota with an emphasis in management and nutrition. And prior to working at Multimin, he worked for Vigortone Ag Products for 16 years. So another little tidbit about Al is that he did actually participate in South Dakota's extension mineral program for his own herd. So we know that he can be a great advocate for, testing your minerals in your feed and your water and how that can affect your animals. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Al.
Well, Rebecca, thank you very much. And thank you to Ward Laboratories, yourself, and Hannah Dorn for organizing this and giving us this opportunity to share this information. I think I hope everybody gets something out of it. And I think it's a great topic and surely a topic that ends up being something that I discuss quite frequently. I'd just like to welcome all the attendees that are watching in person and any of those that are viewing the recording later. Dr. Cain and I would like to share with you some updated information on the use of Multimin 90 in high selenium areas and the role that Multimin 90 plays in overcoming the challenges of antagonisms. I'll introduce Dr. Cain. Dr. Kevin Cain is the director of our technical services for Multimin USA, which is an Axiota animal health company. Dr. Cain grew up in central South Dakota on a cow-calf operation. He attended and graduated from Kansas State University with a degree in veterinary medicine. And from there, he moved back to Miller, South Dakota, where he owned and operated his vet clinic practice for 12 years before joining Multimin USA in 2019 and has been a full-time technical service veterinarian for us since then. And he currently lives in Manhattan, Kansas. And he's been a great advocate and member to the Multimin team, and I've enjoyed working with him. And with that, Dr. Cain, I'll turn it over to you for our presentation.
You bet. Thank you, Al. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. Definitely looking forward to this presentation this afternoon and being able to partner with Ward Laboratories to provide this information. With a background in growing up in South Dakota and practicing there for 12 years, Definitely gave me a good understanding with some of the high selenium levels that we deal with up in those areas, and what Al has had to fight against in those areas as far as the selenium. And so it's been able to give us a good understanding, being able to do some testing throughout the states and getting some of that information back and kind of determining where we can use Multimin and how we can still make it work in some of those high selenium areas. So today we're going to talk about how it can be used in those high selenium areas and how it can bypass antagonists. So we're going to kind of start off today just talking just briefly on nutrition, and then focusing on what those antagonists are and what kind of impact they can have on those trace mineral statuses on those animals. And then we're going to kind of go into more about a little bit of the testing. So when we look at just the mineral nutrition in general for cattle, we kind of look at that as a pretty broad term there as nutrition, and focusing mainly on that energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins. When we really look at that mineral levels, we need to break that down into another step and classify that as macro minerals and micro minerals, or the trace minerals. The trace minerals being in the supplements or in those forages in very small amounts, but can have a very big impact on reproduction and the immune function and overall herd health in that herd. So as we start off just talking about some of those challenges that we face out there in those environments with the forage quality, the water, we're presented a lot of challenges that we've got to face. One of that is we've got a big fluctuation in those trace mineral statuses in those animals throughout the different production cycles in a year. And so how are we going to address those changes and supply that in an efficient manner to where we can maintain good production levels? We're also going to fight against antagonists. So antagonists being in the soil, the environment, the forages, the water, maybe some of those byproducts that we're feeding. That's going to tie up some of those trace minerals and have a pretty big impact on some of that supplementation. We'll go into more detail on that here in a little bit. But then also we're going to have individual variation on intake. Some of those animals are going to consume those oral products out there and available. Some might not even touch it. And so we're going to deal with that. And then we're going to have quite a bit of variation in absorption. So depending on the quality of those oral supplements and how we're providing that, there's going to be a big impact on what those animals can absorb and get in return. So we look at the ruminant trace mineral nutrition. It's really got to overcome 4 hurdles. So one is absorption. When we talk about copper, we're going to deal with pretty low absorption rates on that, between that 1% and 5%. And so when we're dealing with that low of an absorption rate, and we have an impact from any antagonistic levels in that environment or in the water, that's going to cut that in half by pretty quick. We're also going to have to fight that antagonist. So making sure that we're providing those supplements that are absorbed after they have to compete against any antagonists. Number 3, we're going to have to deal with intake. So are those animals consuming that on a constant basis year round? We're going to see some individual animal intake variation, and we're also going to see some seasonal variation depending on the forage quality and the availability of those trace minerals. And then the 4th one there is excretion. So when we talk about copper only absorbed between that 1% and 5%, where's the other 95% of that going? And that's going to be excreted in the feces or the urine. And so being able to have an impact on those trace mineral levels at a quick and effective time where we can focus on those critical production points and have an impact on reproduction and immunity is going to be a key player. So when we talk about the trace minerals and having to compete against any antagonists, when we talk about that, there's 4 main antagonists that we really focus on. Sulfur being the one there in the upper middle, that is going to tie up any of those trace minerals that are available or being provided through that oral supplement or forages. Iron is going to be another antagonist that we're going to have to compete against. And in some areas, we deal with really high levels of that. In some areas, we don't have to worry about that near as much. Calcium being the third antagonist there. But then also when we talk about sulfur or moly, molybdenum is an antagonist. And so when we get in those environments where we have high levels of sulfur and high levels of molybdenum, that's really going to have an impact on that absorption rate, especially copper. So one thing to note is that sulfur is required as part of that diet. And so when we look at that, we do recommend that being able to maintain that requirement of that 0.15%. But what happens when we start exceeding that requirement for that animal? So when we get to that marginal level at that 0.25%, that's going to start to have some impact and antagonistic level on those trace minerals. But when we start getting above that 0.3% sulfur in the diet, then we're going to start seeing major reductions in absorption rates of those trace minerals. So when we look at just what are some of the common sources that can add in additional sulfur levels to those diets, distiller grains can have an impact there, as that can sometimes be higher levels of sulfur than what we want it to be. Molasses can add in additional sulfur. We look at alfalfas and brassicas, that can have some higher levels of sulfur. And then also we got to look at, if those forages have been fertilized with fertilizer that contain high levels of sulfur, that can push those levels up as well. And then we never want to forget water. Water source is very important for these animals to thrive and provide the production levels that we want in return out of them. But some of them water levels can have some very high levels of sulfur that can have some pretty big impacts, especially when we look at some of these drier years. If we're relying on stock ponds and dams for those animals to drink out of, as that water evaporates, those sulfate levels tend to become more concentrated or higher in those water levels and can have some pretty big impacts. So water, it is an essential nutrient that contains antagonists that can tie up some of those nutrients. So we always recommend doing some water testing. That there you can send those samples into Ward Laboratories. They'd be more than happy to test that for you. But generally, when we're looking at these, we're going to look at those TDS or total dissolved solids. That's going to be one of the main factors we'll look at, and then looking at some of those individual antagonistic levels as well, such as sulfates, calcium, iron, and molybdenum. So when we look at just some of the published studies out there done on water quality and the impact it can have on beef cattle, we generally want to see those levels below that 600 to 700 parts per million. When we get in that range of 500 to 1500 parts per million of sulfates, we can start to see maybe just a little bit of decrease in performance. Generally nothing too observable in those animals. But when we start getting above that 1500 level, that's where we can start to see some impacts on health. And then as it starts to get even higher than that, then we'll start seeing some pretty major negative effects on the health and performance in those animals. This here is that study. This was done by Dr. Trey Patterson, looking at water quality. And this was done in South Dakota in 2002. And when we look at just when we start to get those trace mineral levels higher in some of those waters, so that 400 parts per million, we can see that their average daily gain was 1.79 pounds. At that 1700 parts per million sulfates, that average daily gain dropped to 1.65. And then once we got it even higher to that 29 and 4600, we can see that there's pretty drastic decreases in average daily gain. So when we look at that and the performance on those animals, being able to test that water and checking to see what those sulfate levels are, whether they're at a safe level for those animals to perform, is going to be very important. So as we talked about moly and sulfur being in the same environment and just what kind of impacts that will have as far as performance and overall health, when we look at Why that is because when those two antagonists are together in that same environment, the rumen environment, the sulfur and moly are going to bind together, and that is going to form a complex called thiomolybdate. That there will bind to copper and move into the bloodstream. And so it can tie up copper in the rumen, in the small intestine. Then also when this thiomolybdate complex goes into the bloodstream, it can tie up some of that copper that's already in their system. So if we do blood tests on these animals, we look at copper levels. That is a very unreliable means of testing those copper levels in those animals, because even though we pull blood and it shows that there's copper in the blood system, if it is bound to this thiomolybdate complex, it might not even be available for that animal to utilize. So not only can it have an impact on the absorption of copper in the rumen and small intestine, but it can also tie up copper systemically within the animal. So just to kind of show what kind of impact it can have on copper absorption if we have sulfur and moly in that same environment. If we look at the basal diet at 0.1% sulfur and a half a part per million of moly, there's really no impact on the reduction of copper absorption. But if we add in that diet, 4 parts per million of moly, that will cause a slight reduction in copper absorption at a negative 0.5%. If we take out that moly and just add in 0.3% sulfur, that will cause a negative 31% reduction in copper absorption. So sulfur alone will tie up or block the absorption of 31% of that copper. But what happens in that diet when we have moly and sulfur in there together? That bottom line there showing that 4 part per million moly and 0.3% sulfur, that will create a negative 62% reduction in copper absorption. So when we look at the absorption rate of copper and having any antagonistic interference with some of these, such as moly and sulfur, that will cut that in half by pretty quick. So then also thinking about with that moly and sulfur, forming that thiomolybdate complex and being able to tie up copper systemically, we will see some pretty big impacts on that copper trace mineral status very quickly. So what does that look like as far as some of the high levels of selenium in South Dakota, and just how is that represented within the animals across the state? So is what we wanted to do is we know that selenium, when we look at these more mature animals that have been exposed to these areas, we know that selenium just accumulates year after year. They don't really have a good means to expel or get rid of enough of this selenium throughout the year. And so those animals that have been there for a while, more mature, will see those selenium values creep up year after year. So we know that as with having an injectable trace mineral product that contains selenium, that's definitely a concern, and we do not want to inject those animals and create any kind of issues as far as too much selenium. So we took a look at to see, okay, what happens on these younger animals? We know that those calves, they are relying on the trace mineral status from that cow during that last trimester of gestation. That is where they're going to get majority of their trace minerals. The reason for that is because there's virtually 0 trace minerals in colostrum or milk. So what that calf has the day they're born is what they're going to have for that first 100 to 150 days of life. That animal's not putting anything back in their system, and we know that they're going to deplete out those trace minerals very quickly. So what happens if we start to focus on those younger animals and looking at those selenium levels to see if those animals are a good candidate for an injectable product such as Multimin 90? So if we look at the state of South Dakota, we went into some of those higher selenium areas that we know of, or that we hear reports from veterinarians and producers. Those white dots there just kind of representing some of those areas where we did collect some samples. And we can see that when we're along that Missouri River breaks and in some of those areas, that is where we tend to see some of those higher selenium levels. We look at the state of North Dakota, those two white dots there representing where we pulled some samples there as reported from veterinarians dealing with high selenium levels there. So what kind of results did we get and what kind of information did we find? So if we look at the report on those samples, and these were in calves right at preconditioning or weaning is when we drew blood on these animals. So when we're looking at selenium levels in animals, we can use whole blood, serum, or liver. All three are very accurate and reliable means of determining the selenium levels within that animal. So on these almost 200 samples here that we tested in these calves at preconditioning or weaning, looking at where they fall because we know that they're using those trace minerals that they're born with. So if we look at this report, we can see that this bottom red line, that's where when on the reference range, that would be the minimum selenium we'd like to see in those animals. And this upper red line here going across is the upper reference range. So those animals that are between those two red lines are within the normal range. And so when we look at all the studies that Multimin has done, it has been done on well supplemented animals. So animals that are within the normal range, and we still see the benefits that we do with reproduction and immune function. So all those animals right there between the two red lines, we know that we can safely put Multimin in those animals and still see these kind of benefits. But what happens with these animals that are slightly above that red line or up there at the top? And so if we look at this graph, we can see knowing on the metabolism of Multimin and how it interacts within that animal, that if those animals are below that 2.5 whole blood selenium, we can safely put Multimin in there and not have any adverse events. So when we look at almost all these 200 samples of calves in high selenium areas, there's only 3 of those animals that would be of concern or high level of selenium that we'd be pretty cautious about. Now, looking at that and knowing that, you know, they're just slightly above that 2.5, there's probably not going to be any kind of impact. And when we consulted with the toxicologist, they didn't seem to be too concerned if those 3 animals were given an injection of Multimin. So is what it tells us is that we know in these younger animals coming out of these high selenium areas that we can still safely use an injectable product such as Multimin and see the benefits of that on reproduction and immune function and not have to worry about pushing those selenium levels too high.
Dr. Cain, just to clarify on that slide, I couldn't remember if you mentioned it or not, but those samples were taken on calves in the fall at preconditioning time.
Yep, preconditioning and weaning. Yep. So when we look at, you know, where we're going to focus, you know, being able to impact the vaccine response and that immune function, we know we can put an injection in those animals at that preconditioning or weaning phase in those animals and see that better vaccine response, better immune response. So this here was just another group of animals that we tested in a high selenium area. This was whole blood, just looking at the cow versus the calf. So those blue lines there are the sample results from the cow and the orange line there from the calf. And so when we look at those, we can see that those calf levels are going to be lower than what the cow whole blood selenium levels are going to be within that environment. Looking at these results on this graph here, we can see that there's only 2 of those calves that are slightly above that normal reference range, and that would still be of no concern for us to utilize an injectable product and have any type of adverse event. And those samples there were taken in the fall as well. So right around that time for those calves to be getting that preconditioning or that weaning vaccine. So this here is looking at selenium whole blood levels in calves. These samples were taken from a seed stock operation in South Central South Dakota near that winter area, where we know that they are always dealing with those high selenium levels, and that's always a concern for those producers. So when we took these blood levels, these were on newborn calves, and looking at where those samples fall, we can see that they're at the bottom of that reference range. So even if we were to recommend an injection of Multimin on these newborn calves to impact that innate immune system and any challenges that they're going to face as far as environmental scours or early respiratory disease, we know that we can safely put it in these animals and see the benefits of an injectable trace mineral and see the results. As we look at those samples, that upper reference line being the upper part, that lower reference line should be down here at 0.2. And so all those animals there are falling towards the lower part of that reference range. This here was a group of heifers. We pulled selenium samples on right prior to breeding, looking at and focusing on if these producers want to utilize injectable trace mineral to increase the copper, zinc, selenium, and manganese within those animals and have an impact on reproduction. With these being yearling heifers, would it be safe to go ahead and utilize injectable product and still see the benefits that we've seen in multiple reproductive studies that we have done? Looking at the results of within this study, we can see that there was just 3 of those animals that were just slightly above that reference range, referring to the toxicologist and the interpretation that they gave. That was no concern for those animals just being slightly above that reference range and still receiving an injectable trace mineral product. So we know, in those younger animals, whether it's that, birth to weaning phase in those animals, or even on those yearling heifers prior to breeding, we can still safely utilize an injectable product and see those benefits. This here is some liver biopsy results that we took up in South Dakota. This was in a higher selenium area. And so just kind of looking at, trying to emphasize the importance of how much information we can obtain from doing liver biopsies. This is a procedure that their local veterinarian can do. This report will analyze 13 different trace minerals and how they are stored within the liver. The liver is the primary sample that we like to look at when looking at trace mineral status within the animal or the herd. And so looking at these samples, this here is liver copper dry weight. We can see that we've got 2 of these animals that are right there at the bottom end of that reference range. So being very low, we definitely want to have an impact on trace mineral supplementation on those animals. But as we can see, we've got quite a few of these animals that are just at the bottom part of that reference range. So with only 1 animal here at 377, that one there is sitting pretty good as far as copper levels, but all the other ones could definitely use some to impact the reproduction and immune function. This is the part that we also want to look at as zinc is a very important trace mineral for reproduction, fertility, ovulation, and also the immune function. When we look at it as far as its protection layers, it's going to be very important as far as the epithelium of the skin, the respiratory tract, the GI tract, and it's going to provide that physical barrier for the cornea of the eye and that hoof wall for foot rot. So when we look at these same animals, even though they weren't too bad in copper, when we look at what these zinc levels are, they are kind of concerning because we've got majority of those animals sitting in that deficient range, with the 4 animals that are within the normal reference range just slightly above that. So definitely these animals, according to this testing, could use some additional zinc supplementation. Manganese, very important factor as far as reproduction, as far as ovulation. It's going to be directly tied to cholesterol synthesis, which is going to be the precursor precursor to all reproductive hormones. We can see that manganese is sitting towards the lower end of this reference range. And also manganese is going to be very important for the immune system in that manganese superoxide dismutase enzyme activity. So the ability for these animals to fight off some of that infection and clean up with some of that enzymatic activity, manganese definitely could use some additional supplementation within this herd as well. So the interesting thing is even though we tested these animals in a higher selenium area in South Dakota, the selenium values came back right within the normal range. So kind of just going to, when we're talking about what the intake levels are within the animal, what kind of interaction is going on between the forage quality, and some of those water qualities within that environment, how does that directly tie to the level within that animal? And so definitely recommend producers to utilize forage testing and water testing, send those samples off to Ward Laboratories to get those analyzed, but also, looking at maybe what just some of the interactions are within that animal and what their intake levels are. You can perform or have your vet perform a liver biopsy to determine maybe you're not as high in selenium as what previously thought. So what happens to the trace minerals in these calves? We talked about milk and colostrum having virtually zero trace minerals. So what is that going to do to these trace mineral levels over time in that animal? And how is that going to set them up as far as vaccine response and overall herd health? So when we look at this study was done by Dr. Branham, looking at what happens to copper and zinc within those calves after they are born. So this group of calves, they were born from cows that were well supplemented with copper and zinc during that last trimester of gestation, and all those cows were within the normal reference range. So when that calf is born, he should be born with copper and zinc levels around that 300 to 325 parts per million, represented by that red and green line. But by the time that calf is 56 days old, that calf is already going to burn through or utilize 70% of those trace minerals that he is born with. So when we focus on, what are we generally going to do around that 60 to 90 day time frame? We're going to do a branding or first vaccination on those animals. And then if we follow that green line there out to that 200 to 236 day time frame, we can see that there's almost zero copper left within that animal. So how is that going to set us up for that preconditioning, weaning phase? And what is going to be the success rate of our vaccine protocol if those calves have virtually zero trace minerals left in their system? So when we look at, what happens, just kind of a rendition of that previous information, and that calf is born there at that gray dotted line going across the middle. So that's that reference range or optimal level that we want to maintain that calf throughout those production phases. But as we know from that previous study, after that calf is born, they are going to utilize 70% of the trace minerals that they're born with by the time they are 56 days of age. So we're already going to be approaching some pretty critically low levels at that branding first vaccination. That animal is going to stay at a fairly low level as we approach that weaning preconditioning phase. And it's not until that calf is on a total mixed ration until we start to see that trace mineral level come back up where it needs to be. So if we're going to focus on where we could utilize an injectable trace mineral, we're going to highlight these three critical production points. One there at birth, one there at branding first vaccination, and then targeting one there at that preconditioning weaning phase. Because if we incorporate an injectable trace mineral in at those three given points, we can change that trace mineral status to reflect that blue line. We're going to maintain a better trace mineral level from birth to branding. So as we're setting that animal up and we want them to respond the best they can to vaccination, we're going to see a better outcome. If we incorporate one in there at branding first vaccination, we're going to maintain that calf at a better trace mineral level throughout those summer months as we're exposed to some summer pneumonia, some pink eye, some foot rot. And then we target that area there at preconditioning weaning. So we're going to optimize our vaccine response and set those calves up for the best success we can post-weaning. So just looking at what happens when we utilize a vaccine on these calves. So if we look at this, here's copper. The red line is the group of calves that had just a vaccine. So this calf started normal prior to the vaccine being administered. 14 days later, we can see how much copper that immune system required or utilized just in response to that 5-way modified live. If we look at the blue line here, that is the calf that got a vaccine plus an injectable trace mineral such as Multimin. So this was measured prior to the Multimin given. As you can see, compared to the control group, we started a lot lower. But 14 days later, we were able to supplement that immune response to vaccine and increase that copper level over time. If we look at selenium, we can see almost the exact same response. There, both the control group and the Multimin group started the exact same, but we were able to supplement that vaccine response and increase selenium after 14 days after vaccination. Zinc and manganese, we saw both of those trace mineral levels drop 14 days later, but as you can see from the blue lines there, represented by the Multimin group, that those trace mineral levels did not drop near as drastic as the ones that were given just a vaccine. So being able to target these critical production points and supplementing that immune system at critical times when we know that they're going to rely on these trace minerals to respond to vaccination is going to be a very important factor, and we'll see those results on our vaccine outcome. So when we look at what kind of response that we can have on that immune system in response to vaccination. So if we look at this over here on the left-hand side, this calf here, the red calf with the 53% on it. This was a group of well-supplemented animals that were already weaned and bung broke. So they were on a total mixed ration. Those calves were given a 5-way modified live vaccine, and then they were boosted 21 days later to mimic that preconditioning weaning type of vaccination protocol. We then measured the antibody titer response in those calves to see how many of them had a good vaccine protection level as measured by a 4x antibody titer response. In the group of calves that got the vaccine only, 53% of those calves had a good vaccination status after 2 rounds of 5-way modified live vaccine. If we compare that to the blue calf here that says 80%, that group of animals was the same group of animals. They were given a 5-way modified live plus an injectable Multimin. They were boosted 21 days later and given a second dose of Multimin, and 80% of those calves achieved a good vaccination status. So when we're looking at these vaccination protocols and getting 27% more of those calves to respond to vaccination is going to be very important, because we're going to have better protection and resulting in less animals getting sick and less disease transmission. So we look at why utilize an injectable product and how does that differ. So when we look at the Multimin 90 restores a deficient animal to a proper trace mineral status faster than oral supplementation. And there's a reason for that, because it is an injectable. It can bypass those antagonists that are in the rumen, in the small intestine, or even some of those antagonists such as thiomolybdate that are circulating throughout the bloodstream. So when we utilize an injectable product, we're going to change that trace mineral status within the animal in 8 to 10 hours in the blood. So it is a very quick, very effective way and highly absorbed supply of trace minerals that is going to be able for that animal to utilize very quickly. If we compare that to what our oral products do and how they are going to compete against the low absorption rates and antagonists within that environment, that's going to take time. So when we look at how long that's going to take, in a published study from Iowa State by Dr. Stephanie Hansen showed that it is going to take 28 to 42 days for an oral product to achieve those same results. And when we talk about the supplementation to achieve that 28 to 42 days, that is if those trace minerals are being supplemented at 150% of NRC diet. So when we look at, that at timing of vaccination, why Multimin can have an impact on that vaccine response so quickly and effectively, it's because it's available for that animal to utilize. We look at setting that animal up for the best protocol we can there at preconditioning or weaning and having an impact on the overall health within those animals and vaccine response. It's because that injectable product is going to go to work within that first 8 to 10 hours and available for that animal to supplement that immune response, but then also to supplement that animal during that period of high stress and high demand. So when we look at Multimin 90, it is a fast-acting injectable source of trace minerals. So why would we recommend or utilize an injectable product? Because we're going to see those peak plasma levels within the blood in 8 to 10 hours. We're going to bypass any antagonists that are in the rumen. So where some of our oral products are going to compete against low absorption and some of that antagonistic interference, this product is going to be highly absorbed and being able to utilize by that animal very quickly. We're also going to supplement every animal we inject. So we're going to eliminate some of that individual variation that we are depending on in that oral consumption. So we're going to target that period of high challenge and high demand, and that's why we're going to see those results. So we look at just what are some of the absorption rates and bioavailability of some of those oral products. And when we talk about Multimin, it is not a replacement for good oral supplementation. We still need that out there because that's going to provide the macro minerals and the vitamins that those animals still require. When we look at utilizing an injectable product, it's just to target those animals during a high challenge or high demand and to be able to supplement that reproductive or that immune response. So as reported from the NRC 2001, we can see there that copper has an absorption rate of 1 to 5%. When we look at manganese, a very, very low absorption rate of 0.2 to 1.2%. Zinc, that we see that's a lot better at 10 to 20%, and selenium at around 30%. So what's important here is when we look at going to the hydroxy or the chelated forms of these trace minerals, we do see that have an impact on absorption, and we will see that increase really good for zinc and selenium. However, when we look at it for that copper absorption, that only increases it to 1.5 to 6.5%. So not much of an impact on absorption for the chelated or hydroxy forms of copper. When we look at the bioavailability, we kind of refer to the sulfates as the norm and being referenced at 100% bioavailability. We look at those oxides, they have a very low bioavailability and not able to be utilized very often. If we go to the chlorides or the organic forms, we do see that jump up there fairly decent amount. So there's definitely some benefits to utilizing some of the chelated or hydroxy forms of these trace minerals, depending on your environment and so what some of those antagonistic levels are within that. So when we compare, this is a very well brand name trace mineral, that supplement that's out there on the market, that is to provide 4 ounces per head per day. So that producer is paying for 136 milligrams of copper to go into that animal. So when we calculate that at the 5% absorption rate, in return, that producer is only getting 7.4 milligrams of copper absorbed. And that is not taking into account any antagonistic interference. So once again, if we have sulfur and moly in that environment, and that is causing that negative 62% reduction, that producer is only going to get about 3 to 3.5 milligrams absorbed. So how does that compare to an injectable product, and what's the difference? So when we look at just a 5 ml injection of Multimin, that is going to provide 75 milligrams of copper. So that is going to be highly absorbed. It's not quite 100%. It's around that 98 to 99% absorbed, but that is not going to have any antagonistic interference. So that is why we are able to change those plasma levels within that 8 to 10 hours and see it peak there. And then it's going to go to the liver where it will be stored and utilized by that animal over time. So if we look at, just some of the NRC requirements, this here is just highlighting on the trace mineral requirements on the right-hand side. Those animals during that growing and finishing cattle phase, they do have these recommendations. But when we go to those animals that are going through that stress period or high demand phase, we do see that even the NRC acknowledge and recognize that those animals have a higher trace mineral requirement for copper, manganese, selenium, and zinc, highlighted there with those two circles. So this here, just want to kind of touch base on this, was a recent article that was published at University of Nebraska, Lincoln, by Dr. Mary Dranowski. This was a very good information and really relates on what that availability of copper is in the forage and what kind of antagonistic levels are out there and available to those animals that can tie up some of that trace mineral status. And this testing was done at Ward Laboratories, but very good information to relate to producers and just what those effects are. So on the highlights of this information, this article, forages deficient in copper. So we do have to focus on proper supplementation to meet those requirements of the animal. But also we have to compete against any of these antagonists that are in the forages and the water. So utilizing a lab that is reporting the forage quality based on total copper versus available copper is very important, because we need to account for those antagonists within the forages and in the environment, and what kind of impact that is going to have on that copper that is available for that animal to utilize. We look at also the molybdenum and sulfur. Those are the antagonists that are going to tie up that copper and making it unavailable to that animal. When we talk about, some of these trace mineral statuses throughout the year, we also got to look at some of that seasonal intake variation, some of that individual intake variation. And then when we're dealing with those oral products that we're providing out there available to those animals, we're going to rely on consumption. So making sure that those animals are consuming that on a pretty frequent basis and meeting those requirements of that 4 ounces per head per day, or whatever the feed label recommendation is. Then also we have to take into account some of those negative effects. So we will see those negative production effects if these animals are under supplemented, and we will see negative effects if those animals are over supplemented. So this here was some testing done on 4 groups of weaned calves through the sale barn in Valentine, Nebraska. As reported in this article, one of those groups was deficient in copper. 2 of those groups reported adequate in copper, and 1 group was toxic in copper. So as we talk about having those negative effects, the first group there being under supplemented, we can definitely see some impacts on growth and performance and immune function. And then also in that last group there that was toxic, when we start to get that level too high, we'll start to see some of those same negative effects. So this here was the information reported from Ward Laboratories, looking at the total copper versus available copper. And so being able to look at that and have this kind of reporting information is definitely going to benefit those producers and add a lot of value to them. Being able to look at not just the total copper that's reported in those forages, but also taking into account the interaction on sulfur and moly and what is actually available to those animals is very important. So when we look at the results in some of this, we can see that western and central Nebraska that had enough sulfur and moly in those samples to tie up 95% of the copper. Looking at the results in eastern Nebraska, there was less moly and more copper available. So when we're looking at, our recommendation to producers and veterinarians is we always recommend for them to test these forages, to test the water, and as needed, or if there's still a concern with some of that supplementation and meeting those requirements, to perform a liver biopsy and consult with the veterinarian and test some of those animals. We always have to take into account, some of those antagonists, whether they're in the distiller's grains, the byproducts, or some of that corn syrup. If these producers are utilizing a molasses-based product or feeding a lot of alfalfa, some of those forages that are higher in sulfur and moly can definitely have an impact on the end result in those animals. And some of that sulfur antagonist levels might be that we're just adding directly to the diet with some of those byproducts. So in conclusion, we're always going to recommend that producers utilize laboratories such as Ward to test these forages and test the water. We also recommend to test the distiller's grains because we can see quite a bit of variability from plant to plant and even some variability on time of the day of when these byproducts are produced. We're going to recommend, add as needed to the veterinarian or to the producer to do a liver biopsy to test those animals to directly see how those trace minerals and antagonists are having an impact on the trace mineral status within that animal or within that herd. And we always want to take into account all those antagonists that are in the environment, in the forages, in the water, and in those byproducts. So we're able to utilize Multimin in young animals to enhance that immune response to vaccines. It has the unique ability, with it being an injectable product, it can bypass any antagonistic interference. And it is going to provide the trace mineral supplementation of copper, zinc, selenium, and manganese in a highly absorbable form that is going to hit the peak in the bloodstream within 8 to 10 hours and available for that animal to utilize to support the immune response to vaccines and to target those periods of high challenge and high demand. With that, we'll open it up for any questions or comments.
Okay, so we do actually have one question, which is something I did want to clarify. And it comes from Dr. Jim Sprinkle, and he says, how does Ward Lab determine available copper? What methodology? So we actually do not report available minerals, but I believe that article that he pulled up, Dr. Janowski adjusted the availability based on the levels of sulfur and molybdenum in that particular forage. So that would be something just to be aware that we actually don't report available versus unavailable, and there's no direct test for that. But you can look at all of your minerals and adjust based on that, which is why we have a set mineral package. Selenium is in addition to that. But we want to be sure that if you're concerned about copper, you are looking at, molybdenum and selenium as well, and not looking and saying, oh, we're at the correct levels, it must not be a copper issue. But so far, that's the only question we have. And before we get too carried away, I do want to make sure and thank you, Dr. Cain, for your presentation. Al, I think you said you had some things that you did want to address before we wrapped up, if we don't get any more questions here.
Yeah, I just, thank you again for this opportunity, and just, so everyone understands, Multimin 90 is not the complete answer to your situation. Multimin 90 is to be used in conjunction with a good oral mineral program. We're just using Multimin 90 at those strategic times when we know those animals need some help. And I can tell you that since we were able to collect this data in the high selenium areas, many ranchers and producers are utilizing now Multimin 90 as part of their, whether it be branding or fall preconditioning protocol. And they're getting a nice response. They're really pleased with how the calf health has been a lot better. And we've reduced some of those incidents of disease. So, and I think as we look at those high selenium areas as well, and Dr. Cain did a nice job of mentioning it earlier that we don't recommend using Multimin 90 on those mature cattle that have been on the ranch for some extended period of time. The negative effects are not toxic, right? It's not, if you do give a mature animal a Multimin 90 in a high selenium area, it's not toxicity. It's not death by selenium toxicity. What ends up happening, because it has happened, is just that it may possibly have a negative effect on some of the reproduction, right? So we may not have as many cows bred early up. We may have a little bit higher open rate. So it's not a toxicity issue. It's a negative effect on reproduction. So we just want to avoid that, obviously, and just utilize it in those younger animals.
Thanks for that clarification, Al. So I do have I think it's a pretty good question, and it's kind of tough one for you, Dr. Cain. Carrie Lewis says, how is a good vaccine response defined? It would seem Multimin and preconditioning, you would hope to have a higher than 80% vaccine response.
So when we look at vaccine response, as measured by immunologists and how those animals respond to vaccination, we want to see a 4-fold increase in antibody titer response. So that indicates that those animals responded to the vaccination, their immune system was working properly, and they develop the antibody titer level that is required to meet that response. When we look at that and we look at, that's a lot of the reasons why we recommend, vaccination multiple times throughout the year, is not only are we looking at boosting that vaccine to those animals that responded the first or second time, but it's also in a way to get some of those animals to respond to vaccination that maybe did not respond the first time. So that's how a lot of the vaccines are studied, and looking at a 4-fold increase. And that's what we measured in those animals. The group that got the 2 rounds of vaccine and they were on a good oral supplementation program, 53% of those had a vaccine response as measured by a 4-fold increase in antibody titers. And looking at the group of calves that got vaccine plus Multimin, that was the same measurements there. So when we look at that study and actually look at the individual titer levels of those animals, the group that got just the vaccine only, those calves that did achieve a 4x titer increase had anywhere from a 4 to a 5 to a 6-fold increase in antibody titers. We look at the group of calves that got vaccine plus Multimin, majority of those calves had anywhere from a 5 all the way up to an 8-fold increase in antibody titers. So we had a lot more calves respond to vaccination and a lot higher levels of antibody titers, so better protection.
So can I add on to her question? Because I am kind of just wanting a little more clarification as well. So you're not saying that only 80% of the herd responded at all. It's just that they responded 4-fold or better. Is that correct?
Correct. So the other 20% did not achieve a good vaccination response, meaning they were 4-fold or less. They were less than a 4-fold increase in antibody titers.
Thank you. Okay, so, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things too that we need to kind of just maybe in a cowboy way clarify is that too, we vaccinate every animal when we're preconditioning or we're branding, but we don't actually get every animal to respond to be immunized, right? And so we vaccinate, but we don't truly reach immunization, right? And I think that's maybe a little bit of a misconception. I think a lot of people think since we vaccinated everybody is immunized in that population, but it's a lot of population dynamics in that, can we increase the number that actually reach that minimum immunization level? And I think that's what the Multimin does, is just give the calf the tools that it needs to help have that proper vaccine response and reach that immunized level. So.
And one other thing I'd like to clarify is that study there was done with just a 5-way modified live. So there was only 5 antigens being injected in those animals at that time. When we look at our typical vaccine protocol, rarely are we ever giving just 5 antigens. It's usually a 5-way plus a 7-way. And so the more antigens we inject in that animal at a given time, the harder that immune system is going to have to work to process those individual antigens to develop that immune response. So when we look at, our typical vaccine protocol, we're really emphasizing the importance of trace minerals to supply that immune system to help drive that response and get better protection.
Thanks for that clarification. So we have another question here. It says from Cody Burns, are there many benefits in using Multimin 90 for sheep and goats, as in cattle? And my understanding is this product is just for cattle. So maybe that's something that needs clarified.
So this product is only labeled for cattle, both beef and dairy. And so off-label use in goats and sheep is not recommended at this time. The only information data that we have to present for this topic is on beef cattle and dairy cattle.
Are you guys working towards a product for sheep and goats? I would be very scared to give this to sheep with the copper being in it myself, but.
So in Australia and South Africa, there are other formulations of Multimin that are available for sheep and goats that have lower levels of copper in it or no copper. Maybe in the future at some point in time, those will be available in the United States.
Okay, so we don't have any more questions remaining. So I just want to thank you guys for coming on. We're basically just a little past 2. So if you guys have anything else to say, otherwise, thank you for your very informative presentation, Dr. Cain. And thank you, Al, for all your information and for helping me set this up.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the only thing I'd like to say is if you have any additional questions, you can visit the Multimin USA site and find your local rep on the map on that page. And we'd be happy to help answer any questions and any additional questions that anyone might have from this presentation.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Thanks, you guys.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you.